effective, targeted way possible. This absolutely does not do that. When you have a family that is making $350,000 a year in this country, getting up to thousands of dollars of payments, and $250,000 a year in this country, getting under this proposal a $5,000 check, I would argue, Mr. President, that is not targeted, that is not fiscally responsible, that is not efficient, that is not an effective way to spend the American taxpayers' dollars. Let's help the people who need it the most. We just passed a proposal, signed into law that does that. I think many of us on this side of the aisle are willing to look at other ideas and things that we can do that would help those people more, but this certainly is not it, so I object.
Excuse me, the Democratic leader.
Someday soon. Mr. President, the only thing I would say through the chair to my friend from South Dakota is many of the proposals he proposed as alternatives to our proposal, the Republican majority objected to when we had our negotiations on the CARES bill. We believe this can be in addition to the expansion of unemployment insurance and other things. Given the state of the economy, that is what's needed. And I thank you for that and yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Vermont.
Thank you. And let me say to my friend, Senator Thune, it's certainly, I concur with you, what a pleasure it is to be spending New Year's Day with you and our colleagues, exactly what I know and every other member here wanted to do. But here we are because we have to be here. And we are here because back home in my state and all over this country, millions and millions of families are struggling to put food on the table. They are struggling to pay their rent. They are struggling to come up with the money they need to go to the doctor. And this hits me in a sense, in a personal way. I just received the other day from a colleague of mine in Burlington, Vermont, where I live. Burlington, Vermont, largest city in the state of Vermont, all of 40,000 people. And what a volunteer wrote to me, they said, this is the quote, reporting on a food drive in Burlington, Vermont, where I live. Quote, over 30 volunteers showed up to the Champlain School to help bag groceries and to hand them out to those who came out. Unfortunately, there was not nearly enough donated food to provide a bag to everyone who showed up, despite us planning on an increased need. The line of cars filled the parking lot, wrapped around the school, and went out onto the main road for half a mile. This represented a major uptick from the October event that we were involved in. This is Burlington, Vermont. Hundreds of cars lining up for emergency food, and the volunteers did not have enough food to distribute. They had to say to families who are trying to feed their kids, sorry, we do not have enough food. So what we are doing today is very simple. And that is, Senator Thune and Senator McConnell and others have raised objection to the House-passed bill. And in the United States Senate, when we have differences of opinion, what we should be doing is debating that bill. So all that Senator Schumer is asking, all that I am asking is a simple request. Bring the bill to the floor. Not even asking you to vote for it. Bring the bill to the floor. And on top of everything else, we need 60 votes to pass. 60 votes. Can we get 60 votes? I don't know. I think virtually all of the 48 Democrats will vote for it. It means, Senator Thune, that we need 12 Republicans. I gather we got one right here who indicated he would vote for it. 5 or 6 others have been public about saying they will vote for it. Will we get the rest? I don't know. You don't know. But what is the problem with giving members of the United States Senate the opportunity to vote on the legislation? And when we have that debate, you can come up and you can raise all of your objections, and we can debate it. Now, I hear Senator Thune and Senator McConnell before him talk about this bill being socialism for the rich, which I got to tell you I find, Mr. President, somewhat hysterical, because that's an issue I have been talking about for many, many years. And I am very delighted that my conservative Republican friends now recognize that we do have socialism for the rich. To paraphrase Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who said that we live in a society where we have socialism for the rich and rugged individualism for the poor. King was right. But despite what my Republican colleagues are saying, truth is that according to the Tax Policy Center, the top 5% of Americans, the wealthiest people in our country, would receive less than 1% of the benefits of these direct payments. Less than 1%. Doesn't sound to me like too much socialism for the rich. But while we are on the subject of socialism for the rich, which my Republican friends have suddenly become very concerned about, let me talk about the Trump tax proposal that was pushed very hard by Senator McConnell and the Republican leadership, and where I think every Republican voted for it. You want to talk about socialism for the rich? It is not the bill that puts $2,000 into working class hands all over this country. That ain't socialism for the rich. This is socialism for the rich in that bill. Amazon, oh, by the way, I must say this if I may, we were quoting the liberal Washington Post owned by Jeff Bezos, the wealthiest guy in the world. So here is Jeff Bezos' company, Amazon, and they received a tax rebate. They paid nothing in 2018 in federal taxes. That's a corrupt tax system to begin with. But then on top of that, they received $129 million as a tax rebate. That, Senator Thune, is what socialism for the rich. In fact, this particular company is owned by the richest guy in the world. You gave him a $129 million rebate. But it's not just Amazon. Delta Airlines also paid nothing in federal taxes in 2018, and yet they received a $187 million rebate from that particular bill. Chevron, helping to destroy our planet with their carbon emissions, $181 million in a rebate. That, my friends, is what socialism for the rich is about. Socialism for the rich is not, in the midst of this terrible pandemic, putting a $2,000 check into the hands of working families. Mr. President, truth of the matter is that as a result of this pandemic, we are living through the worst and most difficult economic period since the Great Depression. Tens of millions of families are facing eviction all over this country. In the wealthiest nation on earth, moms are struggling to feed their kids, keep the electricity on, and be able to go to the doctor. Now, I hear from our Republican friends that the economy is doing better, but I would like to just read to them a few of the stories that I have received in my office. We ask people, simple question, how are you doing out there? What's going on in your lives? And we receive many, many thousands of responses from people in every state in this country. Just a few, just to bring some dose of reality here to the United States Senate, which often, in the midst of all of the campaign contributions coming in here from the rich, does not know what's going on in the real world. Here's the real world. Gentleman in Texas wrote, $2,000 is the difference between keeping our apartment and being evicted. Mother in Virginia wrote, $2,000 means I can afford to feed my 3 kids. Now, maybe we should give her a long lecture on macroeconomics and how well the stock market is doing. All she's worried about is feeding her 3 children. Woman in Wisconsin wrote, $2,000 would mean not having to choose between rent and groceries and not having to ration my partner's meds. Woman in Nevada wrote, it means paying my rent and getting life-saving treatment because I can't afford the $50 copay through my work insurance just to see my neurologist right now. Father in Florida wrote, quote, it would mean I could pay my bills. My electricity and phone are about to get shut off. I didn't have money for my son on Christmas, and I won't have money for his birthday on January 2nd. Father in New Jersey wrote, it would mean I could pay off credit card debt accumulated during this pandemic, feed my children, and pay my bills. Parent in Massachusetts wrote, it would mean that I could pay my rent and electricity and put food on the table. Woman in Missouri wrote, it would mean getting out of crushing debt. It would mean survival without daily fear. Someone in Texas wrote, it would mean I could actually put food in the fridge. Man in Maryland wrote, quote, it would mean I don't have to beg or go without food, shelter, and medicine. It would mean my family stays warm another couple of months and my dad gets proper treatment.
Senator, yield for a question.
I would.
I'd like to ask a question of the senator from Vermont through the chair. I have listened to the Republican analysis of the bill which you and Senator Schumer and I are asking for a vote on. A bill which passed the House and would give $2,000 basically in allotments or payments to families across America with certain income restrictions. And I've heard from the other side of the aisle repeatedly that this is socialism for the rich, that this is fundamentally unfair, and that we should do things in a targeted way. That's the argument that's made over and over again. And reference has been made repeatedly to the COVID-19 bill that passed last week with 92 votes, including many of the Republicans, virtually all of them, not all of them, but virtually all of them. And so that bill, if I remember correctly, had a $600 payment included in the bill. And I asked my staff, would you please analyze the formula for distributing the $600 and compare it to the formula for the $2,000, which is part of our bill. And lo and behold, they discovered it's the same formula. So if there is some fundamental moral injustice in the distribution of these funds, then I'm afraid all but 6 of the Republicans are guilty of the same immorality because they all voted for that formula last week when it was $600 and now are scandalized by the notion that the same formula they voted for would be used for a $2,000 payment. I'm sure I've missed something in the translation here. I'd like to ask the senator from Vermont to explain this faux outrage from the Republican side of the aisle.
Well, I think my friend from Illinois missed nothing in the translation. He's exactly right. But I also...
Senator from Illinois makes a good point. Senator, yield for a question.
Yeah.
So if the same formula is used and you're increasing the amount by $1,400 per person, so you're going from basically for a family of 4, what would be $2,400 payment to $8,000 payment, and you phase that down using the same formula, does the senator from Illinois understand the math and why that skews toward people who make a lot more money than they would under the other formula?
If the question's directed toward me, I'll answer it.
Well, I just think that you're making a point and a statement which is not accurate, because you're saying the formula is the same. The formula is the same, but the inputs change. And so the way it ramps down means that somebody who makes $350,000 gets a payment under the Sanders-Hawley proposal that they wouldn't know, and it phases out a lot sooner, as you know. So let's be clear about how that formula works, because you are misrepresenting the way that formula works.
And I asked my friend from...
Senator from Vermont has the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I would ask my friend from South Dakota, do you disagree with the Tax Policy Center, which says that the top 5% of Americans.
It skews entirely different in the income scale. You know that. And all I'm saying is don't misrepresent the facts.
What I am saying is that according to a very reputable tax center organization, people who do this for a living, less than 1% of the benefits of the entire program go to the wealthiest people in this country. So when you're talking about trying to say, oh my God, all of this money is going to the rich, that ain't really true. But I would also ask my friend, where did you suddenly become a religious adherent about concern of socialism for the rich when you gave 83% of the benefits to the rich and large corporations in the tax bill that you supported? Where was your concern about socialism for the rich when Amazon, owned by the richest guy in the world, got a $129 million tax rebate? I didn't hear much about socialism for the rich during that debate. Yeah.
Very simply, what you are suggesting, so what you're saying here is the owner of the Washington Post who said this is really bad policy and shouldn't be done in this way at the end of this year. Is that what you're saying, that because he is a wealthy person that somehow that's why he's making that statement? I think the Washington Post editorial board in most cases would be very sympathetic to the senator from Vermont's argument because they take a liberal point of view on almost every issue. My point very simply is that we have limited amount of resources. This is borrowed money, as the senator from Vermont knows. And when we spent months, literally months, and you asked, why can't you guys just come down here? Why can't you just come down here and debate this? We tried 4 months to get the Democrats down here to debate a bill. We've put a bill on the floor in September. We put a bill on the floor in October, a coronavirus relief bill. And you guys blocked it. You didn't even want to talk about it. You didn't want to have an opportunity to amend it. We've been working at this 4 months, and we finally arrived after months at a proposal that helps people who need it the most, including nutrition assistance, including rental assistance, and including checks to people, $2,400 per family,
Reclaiming my time.
and including unemployment.
All that I'm saying, this is a great debate. John, we should have this debate. And in 2 minutes, John, I'm going to give you the opportunity to say you support what we're doing, and then we will have this debate. That's your opportunity. But I want to get back. The senator from South Dakota did not answer the question that there was not apparently huge concern about socialism for the rich in the bill that they supported, or worried about the debt that would incur. So I see, if I may say so, a bit of hypocrisy here. Senator Thune and the Republican leadership wants to debate this issue. So do I. I think it's a great debate. Great debate. Now, as everybody knows, Senator McConnell proposed an idea. I don't agree with it, but it's an idea that's worthy of debate and discussion. And he said, let's combine 3 elements together. Let's incorporate the bill passed in the House by 2/3 of the House, including 44 Republicans. Let's add to that the repeal of section. I'm going to bring your bill to the floor, show you what a nice guy I am. New year, I'm going to bring Mr. McConnell, Senator McConnell's bill right to the floor and give you an opportunity to vote for it. All that I am asking, while I bring Senator McConnell's Republican bill to the floor, we are going to bring the bill that passed the House with 44 Republicans to the floor as well. We'll have 2 votes. 1 vote on Senator McConnell's bill, needs 60 votes to pass. 1 bill on the House. 1 vote on the House bill, 60 votes to pass. That's it. So it's hard for me to imagine how Senator Thune will object to us bringing forward the Republican bill. Here it goes. This is the legalese that I need to say, and I'm going to bring it forth, and I'm sure that Senator Thune will support me in my effort. I ask unanimous consent that if cloture is invoked on the veto message on H.R. 6395, National Defense Authorization Act, that notwithstanding Rule 22, at 3 p.m. today, short period of time, 3 p.m. today, Friday, January 1st, the Senate proceed to the consideration of calendar number 645, H.R. 9051, to provide a $2,000 direct payment to the working class, that the bill be considered read a third time and the Senate vote on passage of the bill, and that if passed, the motion to reconsider be considered, made, and laid upon the table. Further, that following the vote on H.R. 9051, the Senate proceed to consideration of calendar number 644, S5085, that the bill be considered read a third time, that there be 1 hour of debate on the bill, equally divided and controlled by myself or my designee and Senator McConnell or his designee. That following the use or yielding back of that time, the Senate vote on passage of the bill, and that if passed, the motion to reconsider be considered, made, and laid upon the table, all without intervening action or debate.
Is there objection?
Mr. President,
The senator from Missouri.
Mr. President, reserving the right to object, I want to say that I can't for the life of me figure out why it is so difficult to get a vote on the bills that Senator Sanders has just referenced when, by my count, the President of the United States, the Speaker of the House, a large majority of the House of Representatives, and I think a supermajority of this body are all in favor of $2,000 COVID relief payments to working Americans. Now, we've had some back and forth on the floor today about how we got to the level of $2,000. We all know how we got to that level. The President of the United States said that's the level he supported. The number originates with him. This is the number that he has asked for, and the House adopted it. And a majority of senators have said already publicly that they support it. And yet we can't seem to even get a vote on it. We can't even seem to have debate on it. I mean, with all due respect, this doesn't seem to me to be a Republicans versus Democrats issue. This seems to be the Senate versus the United States of America. And I just don't understand it. And I'm willing to bet that the American people don't understand it either. I mean, here we are in the throes of the worst pandemic in a century that working people have borne the brunt of. And all that we're asking is that those working people be first in line for relief, and that they be given meaningful relief that is only approximately commensurate with the hardships that they and their families have borne. Now, I hear a lot of talk about how we can't afford it. I do notice, however, that we seem to be able to afford all kinds of other stuff. We can afford to send lots of money to other governments. We can afford to send all kinds of tax breaks and bailouts to big corporations. We can afford to spend enormous sums of money on pork, hundreds of billions of dollars in that last bill on pork, hundreds of billions. But we can't seem to find the money for relief for working people that the President and the House and the Senate all support, and yet we can't seem to get onto the floor. Let me just share 3 stories that I've heard just this week alone, from my home state, from Missouri. Danielle from St. Louis County, she called my office. She said her utilities are about to be shut off. She's desperate for help. She said a $2,000 payment would go a long way to help keep the lights on and her house warm. I heard from a mother in southeast Missouri, that's the boot heel of my state. She wrote that her son had lost pay because of his company cutting back hours because of COVID, and that he had himself contracted the virus, and so he'd had to be home, and he was missing work, missing shifts. His family can't make it paycheck to paycheck. His husband, her daughter-in-law, is donating plasma in order to help earn some extra grocery money. Donating plasma in order to get some money to pay for groceries to feed their family. Richard from St. Louis wrote to me that any extra help that he could get would go directly to paying his rent and his utilities. He had a job that he lost in the retail business, retail sector, and he's desperately struggling. I'll just say, Mr. President, these are not people who are ne'er-do-wells. These are working people. These are strong people. These are proud people. And all that they ask for, as I have said many times on this floor before, is a chance to get back up on their feet and to be able to provide for their families. And I can't for the life of me understand why we cannot get so much as a vote on these bills. And so for that reason, Mr. President, I do not object. In fact, I enthusiastically support the measures that Senator Sanders is trying to bring to the floor, and I'd vote for them both if we were given the opportunity.
Is there objection?
Mr. President.
The senator from Texas.
Mr. President, reserving the right to object, I know Senator Toomey is delayed coming to the floor. On his behalf, I will object.
Objection is heard. Morning business is closed, and under the previous order, the Senate will resume consideration of the veto message on H.R. 6395, which the clerk will report.
Veto message to accompany H.R. 6395, an act to authorize appropriations for fiscal year 2021 for military activities of the Department of Defense and so forth and further purposes.
Mr. President,
Senator from Oklahoma.
are we in a quorum, Carl?
We are not, sir.
All right. Mr. President, these will be the last few words that Senator Reid and I will talk about before the vote, and I want to mention something that I haven't talked about as much as I probably should have. First of all, the cooperation working with Senator Reid and his staff, and this is a long, enduring thing. It's hard for people to believe, but we're actually starting on next year's bill now. We've already started, so it's going to be another long.
The Senate will be in order, please.
Since I thought I mentioned something that hasn't been talked about as much as it should have been talked about, that since we've suffered arguably the worst cyber attack in American history, this is the most significant piece of cyber legislation in American history. It contains 27 of our Cyber Solarium Commission recommendations. 27 are in this NDA, to include provisions that are directly relevant to SolarWinds hack that would have allowed us to get ahead of this, most notably by allowing CISA, the Cybersecurity Division of DHS, to begin hunting for threats on .government networks. Now, we have other recommendations to enhance our cyber resilience for our nuclear command and control systems in this NDAA, establishing a national cyber director in the NDAA, strengthening CISIS, and elevating its leadership, giving it more resources. I fear that the SolarWinds attack is a harbinger of things to come. I'm very proud of the work our commission has done, and the provisions are absolutely critical. The final thing I'd say is that This is arguably the most serious piece of legislation when it comes to deterring China that we've had in decades, if not ever, including provisions such as the Pacific Deterrence Initiative. This is kind of a follow-up from the last year's European Deterrence Initiative. We're concentrating more on Russia. But this is Pacific, this is China. That's what the whole division of this bill is about, to enhance our presence and our deterrent posture in the Indo-PACOM provisions, protecting against Chinese industrial espionage, more transparency for Chinese military companies, reporting on Chinese United Front Work Department in the United States and abroad. And the list goes on and on. It's a very serious piece of legislation when it comes to deterring China. And that's one of the things that we're concerned about. China is our #1 threat and will be for perhaps, regrettably, decades to come. So this bill brings us along where we should be. And once again, I want to say the effort that has gone into this bill, the weekends, the hard work, and Liz King and John Bonzo, I'd have to say to my good friend Jack Reed that they probably worked more weekends than they have not worked on weekends. So it's been a real effort. It's the most important, most significant piece of legislation that we'll pass, and this next vote's a very critical vote. And I would yield to Senator Reed for any comments that he would like to make about this. But I want to keep in mind that this is a real, people are talking about the Democrats and Republicans don't do things together. This has been an example of what can happen in government.
Mr. President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. Let me first begin by commending the chairman for his extraordinary effort. He led this process. Let there be no mistake about it. He rose to the challenges, and this has probably been the most challenging NDAA that I have witnessed in more than 20 years in the United States Senate because of many different effects. The pandemic, the need for social distancing in terms of hearings, the whole scope of challenges that have arisen in the past few months, and the chairman has done a remarkable job. Let me start by saying that this is essential for our national security. This bill is not optional. If we want to continue to maintain our security for the United States, we have to pass this legislation. It's that simple. What does it do? Well, it does things that we have to do every year. One, it provides for the support for our servicemen and women and their families. And I know we're all celebrating New Year's Day here. And, you know, it's kind of disconcerting to be working when everyone else is partying. But if you feel a little bit sort of like put upon, think about the soldiers in forward operating bases in Afghanistan that are facing danger. Think about the submariners and the ballistic submarines that have been at sea for months now, protecting the United States. Think about the airmen that flew the B-52 bombers to send a signal of deterrence to Iran. Think about them and their families, and you'll appreciate, I think, more of what they do every day and what we might do once in a while. One of the issues that the chairman spoke about was cybersecurity, absolutely essential. And as he said, we based our efforts on an extraordinarily insightful report by the Solarium Commission, headed by Angus King on our side, Congressman Mike Gallagher, and I want to make sure I say Mike Gallagher because I think I identified him with another Irish name last week, but it's Congressman Mike Gallagher. And I must give credit to Jim Langevin, my colleague from Rhode Island, who is one of the key cybersecurity experts in the House. Every day we are learning more about the extent of the Russian penetration of our whole national security apparatus and civilian companies. Just today, Microsoft announced that they had been deeply penetrated by the Russian incursion. And I suspect it's very serious. This legislation responds, in fact, it was done remarkably before we knew of it, but responds specifically to this type of attack on the United States. It gives agencies the authority to audit other agencies in terms of their cybersecurity, and it's just the first step. But if we don't take this step, will be further behind. Now, the other thing I want to point out, too, is echoing what the chairman said about the Pacific Defense Initiative. We've identified $2 billion that can be used, and we will focus upon how it's used to create a new strategy. This is really the first time that we have stepped back and said, let's set up a strategic posture that recognizes the true threats that China is now presenting to us in the Pacific. It's the first time we've done it. And what it does, it builds on our close relationships with key allies, Australia, Japan, South Korea. It does that by a series of steps. First, sort of command post exercises where we check our communications. Second, real exercises, getting to the point where large-scale joint exercises involving not only our key allies, but many other countries become possible. That will set us up for the ability to deter China. When they see all of the nations of the Pacific that have worked with us closely, that are prepared to work with us, that will be a great deterrence. And that's the goal of this effort. So any suggestion that China is happy about this bill is completely baseless. And then finally, again, I must, like the chairman, thank the staff for their extraordinary work. John Bonsall, Liz King, all the staff members. But ultimately, again, my congratulations to the chairman for his great work. Of course, I urge passage. Again, I think this is essential. As I spoke before, there are thousands of soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, Coast Guardsmen on the watch as we speak. It's our obligation to them to give them the tools they need to protect us. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. President. I yield the floor.
I'd go so far to suggest that
Senator from Oklahoma.
this is the most significant of the bills that we've passed every year for the last 59 years. And Mr. Chairman, I'd ask unanimous consent that the mandatory quorum call be waived with respect to the motion to invoke cloture on a veto message on H.R. 6395 NDAA.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered. Motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the veto message on H.R. 6395, an act to authorize appropriations for fiscal year 2021 for military activities of the Department of Defense and so forth and for other purposes, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the veto message on H.R. 6395, an act to authorize appropriations for fiscal year 2021 for military activities of the Department of Defense, for military construction, and for defense activities of the Department of Energy, to prescribe military personnel strengths for such fiscal year, and for other purposes, shall be brought to a close. The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Aye.
Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt.
Votes yes.
Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Ms. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Gardner. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley, Ms. Harris, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Jones, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mrs. Loeffler, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Seth, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Baldwin, Blunt, Burr, Cantwell, Collins, Cornyn, Duckworth, Ernst, Feinstein, Fisher, Grassley, Hassan, Heinrich, Inhofe, Kelly, Leahy, Peters, Reed, Roberts, Romney, Rosen, Rounds, Schumer, Scott of Florida, Shaheen, Thune, Toomey, Udall, Whitehouse, Wicker. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Casey, aye. Senators voting in the negative. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mrs. Murray, aye. Mr. Johnson, aye. Senators voting in the negative. Booker, Braun, Kennedy, Lee, Sanders, Van Hollen, Wyden. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Shelby, aye. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Merkley, no. Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Mr. Paul, no. Mr. Cardin, aye. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Mr. Schatz, aye. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, aye. Mr. Brown, aye. Mr. Manchin, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Ms. Smith, aye. Mr. Portman, aye. Mrs. Blackburn, aye. Ms. Sinema, aye. Mr. Langford, aye. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Enzi, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mrs. Capito, aye. Mr. Kramer, aye. Ms. Harris, aye. Mr. Moran, aye. Ms. Warren, no. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez. Aye. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy. Aye. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Aye. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand. Aye. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper. Aye. Mr. Daines. Mr. Daines. Aye. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Hawley. No. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Rubio. Aye. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tillis. Aye. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons. Aye. Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Cortez Masto. Aye.
This is wrong anyway.
On this vote, the yeas are 80, the nays are 12. 3/5 of the senators duly chosen and sworn having voted in the affirmative, the motion is agreed to.
Mr. President,
You need a mic.
I've got a
The
mic.
Senate will be in order. Senators, please take your conversations outside. The Senate will come to order. The senator from Rhode Island. The senator from Oklahoma.
Thank you. Thank you. We are going to go to final passage, and I just want to make one comment that this is really a significant vote, not just because it's the NDAA and many of us
Will come to order, please.
A lot of people contend, as I do, that every year the NDAA is the most significant vote that we have. This year, especially so, in light of all the disruptions and problems that we've had. And once again, I want to say how great it's been to work and show the American people that Democrats and Republicans can work together and get significant legislation passed. I'm very proud that we have this bill. And I'm proud to have worked with Senator Reid and his staff.
This legislation is essential to the national security of the United States and to the welfare of the troops and the families who defend us every day. I would urge all of my colleagues to vote to override the veto. I want to thank Senator Inhofe for his extraordinary leadership, commend our staff, John Bonsall on the Republican side, Liz King on the Democratic side, and all the staffers. And again, I urge a vote to override. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader.
I know no further debate.
Is there any further debate? If not, the question is, shall the bill pass, the objections of the President of the United States to the contrary notwithstanding? The yeas and nays are required, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Scott. Dave. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman.
You can change it home with
Mr. Braun. I did, thank you. I did. Lay, you're an aye? Thank you. Okay. Thank you. Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. I got you. Thank you. Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy.
You got me, ma'am, right?
I do, thank you.
Happy New Year.
You too. Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Mr. Durbin. I did, thank you. I did, thank you. Mr. Enzi. Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gardner. Thank you. Mrs. Gillibrand. I did. Mr. Graham. Murray. You too. Mr. Grassley, Ms. Harris, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Hirono. Thank you. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Jones, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly. I got him. I got him. Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Lankford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mrs. Loeffler, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass. I got him. Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, thank you, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Barrasso, Bennett, Blackburn, Blumenthal, Blunt, Bozeman, Brown, Burr, Capito, Cardin, Carper, Cassidy, Collins, Coons, Cornyn, Cortez Masto, Kramer, Crapo, Daines, Duckworth, Enzi, Ernst, Feinstein, Fisher, Gillibrand, Grassley, Hassan, Heinrich, Hyde-Smith, Inhofe, Johnson, Kane, Kelly, Klobuchar, Lankford, Leahy, Manchin, McConnell, Menendez, Moran, Murkowski, Murray, Peters, Reed, Roberts, Romney, Rosen, Rounds, Rubio, Schatz, Schumer, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Shaheen, Shelby, Tester, Thune, Tillis, Toomey, Van Hollen, Warner, and Whitehouse. Mr. Risch, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Kennedy, Lee, Merkley, and Paul. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Murphy, aye. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Hoeven, aye. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Yeah. Mr. Braun, no. Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Wyden, no. Mr. Booker, no. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Udall, aye. Ms. Sinema, aye. Mr. Sanders, no. Ms. Warren, no. Ms. Cantwell, aye. And Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Hawley, no. Mr. Wicker, Aye. Mr. Cruz? No. Ms. Smith? Aye. Mr. Casey, aye. Ms. Harris, aye. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Cotton, no.
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to vote or change their votes? Seeing none on this vote, the yeas are 81, the nays are 13. Two-thirds of the senators voting, a quorum being present, having voted in the affirmative, the bill on reconsideration is passed. The objections of the President of the United States to the contrary notwithstanding.
Senate will come to order. The chaplain, Dr. Black, will open the Senate with prayer.
Let us pray. Almighty God, our gracious King, you are the one clear power of love in the midst of lesser powers. Thank you for giving us the confidence